Why was the industry largely in favor of leaving? On June 24th, 2016, people around the world rubbed their eyes. When asked, should the United Kingdom remain a member of the European Union or leave, 51.9% of voters voted for leave. For many, this result came as a surprise. Wasn't the City of London, pampered by all political forces, in unison in favor of a remain? What happened? Wasn't the most powerful financial sector in Europe powerful enough to make its voice heard on such an important question of the future? In reality, the city had been demonstratively and loudly committed to remain, but under this guise it was discreetly and yet very energetically running another campaign. The UK Electoral Commission now reveals available data with three very interesting facts. First, nearly 2/3 of the financial sector's donation went to leave activists, while UK industry donated less than half to them. Second, 57% of the donations for the Leave campaign came from the financial sector, compared with only 36% for the Remain camp. Finally, there were two groups in the city with different positions. One represents the protagonists of the first financialization, that means the traditional financial sector. Banks, insurance companies, financial advisory firms, as well as institutional investors, including pensions funds. The accumulation model of this sector is to encourage private savers to invest their deposits in the stock market for a short time. In this type of value creation, investors do not seek control over the companies whose shares they acquire. Rather, passive investors leave this control to the management of the company. The other faction consists of the protagonists of the second financialization, such as private equity companies and hedge funds. Unlike the traditional players, they collect private investment funds in order to invest them in the medium term in non-exchange traded shares of companies over which they take control. Their business model is alternative in the sense that it is relatively independent of developments in the stock markets. Looking at the sources of funding for the two campaigns, a clear picture emerges. The Remain camp was largely subsidized by the protagonists of the first financialization, the Leave campaign on the other hand by those of the second financialization, with around 94% of the donation volume. Critical economists often describe the EU as an institutionalized refuge of neoliberalism, as a vehicle to deprive the people of their sovereignty in the interests of the financial economy. But this framework, which offers the European financial sector the best operating conditions, has long since become too narrow for the protagonists of the second financialization. With Brexit, they hope that they will be able to invest at will in the future without being restricted by the Brussels Financial Supervisory Authority, which is perceived as too strict. This faction in the financial sector is aiming to turn the city into a kind of offshore platform, says commercial banker and former trader Mark Florentino. Some financial players dream of turning London into a global Singapore, one of all regulatory EU requirements liberated zone in which all emerging economic and financial powers can pursue their more or less clean business without hindrance, he said. It would be a huge tax haven. The British press has made up the term Singapore upon Thames for this. When Boris Johnson took office in July 2019, the representatives of the second financialization made it to 10 Downing Street and captured important government posts. This Brexit faction is sworn to libertarian ideology and wants to restrict any state intervention that goes beyond the protection of private property. The rejection of state regulation at the national level goes hand in hand with resistance to any kind of institutionalization of interstate relations. Their design should be left to the discretion of the states that conclude trade agreements among themselves in accordance with their economic interests. Libertarianism propagates a radically deregulated capitalism as a social system based on the moral, political and economic sovereignty of the individual. According to the Canadian economist and historian of ideas Gilles Dostala, he lived from 1946 to 2011, the libertarians go further than the neoliberals when it comes to restricting the role of the state. The state should not only be deprived of education and infrastructures such as the transport system, but also sovereign powers. This anarchist capitalist movement provides for the complete abolition of the state and the privatization of all its functions, including the army, police and judiciary, which Adam Smith saw as reserved for the state. The venerable Adam Smith had interpreted the common goods as the sum of individual interests. Liberalism should be complemented by laws democratically adopted by sovereign individuals. The neoliberals under Milton Friedman, Friedrich Hayek and Ludwig von Mises advocated that the radical defense of private property and the freedom to enrich oneself would lead to general prosperity and thus to social progress, the so-called trickle-down theory. The supporters of libertarianism, on the other hand, propagate an ethical concept of freedom that ignores the question of its effects on the common good. The absolute primacy of freedom does not arise from the conviction that capitalism is superior because it can create more prosperity than any other mode of production. The freedom to accumulate property can only be justified in itself. In addition, the economic libertarianism to which the protagonists of the second financialization adhere is assuming authoritarian traits at the political level. Since all redistribution mechanisms to meet the basic needs of the population in areas such as health, education and security are rejected, the suppression of social movements and the restriction of civil liberties and rights, including freedom of expression, are considered to be necessary method to ensure social cohesion. Since a systemic reduction of social inequality and the impoverishment of parts of the population is considered illegitimate, only the use of force remains to regulate social life. Freedoms are sacrificed to preserve the most important freedom, the right to own and accumulate property. In the 2010s, the ideas were mainly promoted by think tanks known as Tufton Street because most of them are located on the street in Westminster and London. For example, at 55 and 57 Tufton Street, the Adam Smith Institute, the Taxpayers Alliance, Leave Means Leave, the Global Warming Policy Foundation, the Center for Police Studies, which was founded in 1974 by Margaret Thatcher, by the way, and the Institute for Economic Affairs. These think tanks are largely financed by the actors of the second financialization, but also by industries closely related to them, such as civil engineering, fossil fuels, and the tobacco industry. This network is not limited to the UK. Tufton Street is part of the Transatlantic Atlas network with around 400 organizations that are forming a politically coherent galaxy. This network of libertarianism is also united by the connections to the alt-right movement in the USA and to Tory Brexiteers. These organizations represent an ensemble of ideas that make up the political project of the second financialization. Libertarianism, continuation of Thatcherism, Euroscepticism, Atlantism, authoritarianism, and the questioning of man-made climate change. The political promoters of the second financialization are apparently no longer dependent on democracy as a form of bourgeois rule in order to govern. At the beginning of the 19th century, the emerging bourgeoisie had to gain a new legitimacy that was not based on heredity in competition with the feudal lords and aristocrats who were still very popular in some areas. At that time, the aim was to prevent the possible restoration of the coalition of interests of landed gentry and peasants that had prevailed for almost 1,000 years. Therefore, the bourgeois revolution was able to rely on the reinvention of the idea of democracy based on the idea of popular sovereignty. Today is different. The power of the bourgeoisie is not threatened by any other social class or competing elite. So could it be that when there is no longer any monarchist or socialist threat, it is no longer interested in democracy? That will be a theory to watch in the future. And if you want to stay informed, please subscribe to my channel and my other channels. I'll see you in my next video. Auf Wiedersehen.